that you are ready for the second part of today. Let me share the slideshow again. By the way, before we start with a different topic, I have just seen an additional question in the chat too that was posed after we left from Lena Schillander, if I'm saying correctly, which is an additional question. Is the capped sample size of 50 already acceptable for the 1420 with effect of the upper limit, or is this only applicable for the post-2020? So I have just consulted with Ms. Barbara Koschak from the coordination unit, and I have found that this is a relevant issue, but it's still under internal discussion. So at this moment, we don't have yet an answer if this is applicable or not for the current programming period. Yes, Inguna Kapuza, I hope, in situation where the projected area is above, well, you mean the projected area is below, exactly, 2% is between the projected area and the upper area limit. Is it possible before using the unilateral approach to perform the recalculation of the confidence level? Yes, by all means. We have not brought this to this presentation today, but in parallel with the recalculation of the precision under the unilateral approach, we have also another methodology that is called recalculation of the confidence level, which is available. And again, the idea is, if results are not conclusive, you can recalculate what would be the confidence level that would generate conclusive results. And let's say if this confidence level is still compatible with our assessment about the reliability of the control systems, then it is safe to conclude that the population does not contain material error. Quite so. Any additional final questions regarding any issue from the morning? Okay, if not, a word about regional clustering. Ladies and gentlemen, regional clustering is a very much a new topic. It has been introduced by us relatively recently, a few years ago, and it's still a technique that has started to be used by some audit authorities. I would say not many, but is an extremely useful technique. So regional clustering is not specific to any programming period, can be both applied in the context of 1420 or post-2020. It's a technique that it's not explicitly presented in the Delegated Act, because the Delegated Act pretends to be simple, only presenting the most relevant sampling techniques, and all these variations, including regional clustering, are available to you, but are not included in the guidance notes. In the Delegated Act. By the way, there is a technical document that has been presented in, I'm not sure, a technical meeting or an homologs meeting, where we have presented some detail of the technique, but my goal today here is to tell you what this is, what are the possibilities, without going into the very much technical detail of the formulas, but show you how relevant this may be. So, sometimes it would be very relevant for you to concentrate your audit activities in a limited number of locations. Let me call it locations or regions or areas. Why? Because it would be very convenient to avoid the excessive geographical spread of audit work. It's extremely time-consuming and expensive to have to audit something here, something else 100 kilometers away, something else 300 kilometers away, and so on. And whenever you face in your member state this possible situation of geographical dispersion of the on-the-spot audit activities. And if you would like to find a way to perform some kind of regional concentration of the audit activities, then this, I cannot call it new, but relatively new regional clustering technique is maybe of your interest. This is a technique that can be used in combination with both MUS and simple random sampling. It's important to say that there are formulas to be applied in both situations. In this, let's say, early stage, the Commission considered the application of this technique only to subsample units, okay? Technically, there is no reason not to apply to main sampling units, but at this moment, and during this phase of experimentation, it has been restricted to subsampling units. So either invoices or other expenditure items, or even other sampling units like projects or payment claims that can be considered subsample units. The application, as I said, of the technique is motivated by the opportunity to reduce this geographical dispersion, and by reducing the geographical dispersion, we may significantly reduce the audit burden. Again, I have written there, but it's the same thing as before. For simplicity of language, I will very often talk about operations or invoices or expenditure items, but you know, the main sampling unit is whatever it is, does not need to be the operation, and the expenditure item does not need to be the invoice. But as for simplicity of language, let me use this idea. So imagine I have an operation, a sample of operations, and its operation may be composed of whatever expenditure items we can imagine that can have some geographical dispersion. So the idea is the following. Within each main sampling unit, we have our subsampling units, the invoices or other expenditure items, geographically dispersed by different, I may call it regions or locations. In my scheme here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 regions, 10 locations. And in each location, the red dots tend to represent different expenditure items that pertain to that location. Now, if we select a sample randomly, what will happen is that basically, just due to the randomness, it may happen that I have to audit one item in one region, 2 items in the other item in the other, and by the end of the day, I have to visit the 10 regions, and I have to audit 1 or 2 items in each region. And we have all to agree this is very inconvenient. The idea of regional clustering is this one. Instead of having to audit 1 or 2 items in each region, I will perform the selection of the sample again in 2 stages. This is a kind of subsampling, but a very special one. The first stage is to select a certain number of regions from within the full list of regions, or a certain number of locations from the full list of locations. So in my, let's say, simplistic example in this picture, imagine that we have randomly selected 3 locations out of the 10 possible locations. And then in the second stage, I will audit some expenditure items, in my example, the yellow ones, within each one of the 3 locations. Well, this is very convenient because instead of auditing 1 item in each location, I will audit, in my example, 3 items within each one of these locations. So, what are the principles of regional clustering? It is that we are going to select, probabilistically, of course, a limited number of regions, locations, trying or more than trying, aiming to concentrate the audit work in these locations. The selection of the locations is based on probabilistic selection, either using MUS or simple random sampling. And the selection of, let me call it for simplification, the invoices is confined to the regions, to the locations that have been selected in the previous stage. And in the last stage, I select invoices or whatever are the expenditure items, again, with probability either with equal probabilities or probability proportional to expenditure. So using either simple random sampling or MUS. And again, other forms are possible, like using a stratified MUS or a stratified simple random sampling. So all these variations around these base methods are still, of course, possible in this context. Now, some principles without many technical details. The minimum sample size of regions or locations that we propose that you use is 3. This is really the very minimum. Well, but this can be extremely convenient. Imagine that if you have 20 locations, the possibility to visit just 3 locations instead of 20 is a tremendous gain. Secondly, the minimum sample size of invoices within each operation is 30 as usual. There's nothing new here. It's like any time when you implement two-stage sampling within statistical sampling, your minimum sample size is 30. What is the minimum sample size of invoices within each one of the audited locations? Well, we are going to use the same rules as for stratification, although this is not stratification, but let's use the same rule of 3. So the minimum number of expenditure items per location is 3, and in total, 30 per operation. And then we have developed some methodology that, well, I consider that would be convenient for you to have one of 2 possibilities. That's why I have imagined this methodology, which is either selecting a constant number of invoices in each location. So imagine 3 locations, 10 invoices in each location. And from a practical point of view, it's very convenient because you know that in each new location, the number of invoices will be the same. Or another alternative that may make sense for some of you is the same proportion of invoices in each location. This may make sense in situations where the locations have different sizes. So let's say in each location, I'm going to select 5% of the invoices or 10% of the invoices. So either a fixed number in terms of sample size or a fixed percentage in terms of sample size. So in each location, we select this sample of expenditure items either with fixed sample size or fixed percentage. And we expect by this to facilitate the organization of the audit activity. So just a simplistic example. Imagine that we have decided to select 4 locations. In each location, I have selected 8 invoices, and this gives me a sample size of 32, sorry. The same thing here with the same proportion. This is the example of constant number of invoices, okay? This is the example of a constant percentage of the invoices. In this case, I have selected again 4 regions, but instead of selecting 8 invoices in each region, I select 5% of the invoices in each region, which means that in some regions I may observe more invoices than the other, and I will get a certain sample size. Of course, that if the sample size is smaller than 30, you have to proportionally increase it in order to guarantee that globally you have at least a sample size of 30 under the rules of statistical sampling. Now, several new formulas are available for you. You have formulas to calculate the sample size of invoices within each location of one operation. And we have imagined a methodology, again, in 2 steps that is very simple to implement. So first step for you is to decide how many locations you want to audit. You already know that the very minimum is 3. But depending on the characteristics of the invoices and of the population, a higher number of locations may be required, okay? It may happen that you need to audit more than 3 locations. And moreover, you may have here a high value, if you select locations with MUS, you might have here high value items. And if you have high value items, it's possible that, of course, you have to increase the number of locations in order to guarantee that all locations have a certain probability to be selected to the sample. After you select randomly a certain number of locations, let's imagine you have selected 4 locations. In the second stage, we are going to calculate with a formula the number of invoices that you have to audit in each location. So you have these new formulas. Again, my goal of my presentation today is not to present the technical details. That's why I just brought this one as an illustration. Of course, that you have formulas for simple random sampling, for MUS, for the case where you have a constant number of invoices or a fixed percentage of invoices. But basically, in this formula, you recognize most of the things, the book value, the Z, tolerable error, anticipated error. But there are 2 very conspicuous elements that I would like to call your attention upon. One is M. M represents the number of locations. So once you have deterministically determined that you want to audit 4 locations, in the form you have to input, I'm going to work with 4 locations, and the formula will give you back this NR, which is the number of expenditure items that you have to audit in each region. And the beauty of this is that you can do some sensitivity analysis. You can say, okay, if I choose 3 locations, let me see how many invoices do I have to audit. What about if I choose 4 locations? What about if I choose 5 locations? So you just need to change in the formula M, try to play with the numbers, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever you want to try, and you'll see what is the impact in terms of the final sample size, in terms of items that you have to audit. One thing is for sure, and you don't need to interpret this formula to understand it even intuitively, which is the following. Typically, the larger the number of locations that you accept to audit, the smaller will be the sample size of invoices. Of course, needless to say, isn't it? If you want to concentrate everything in 3 locations, you have to compensate this geographical concentration by increasing a little bit the sample size of invoices. If you are available to go to many different places, of course, that the sample size of invoices can be reduced, okay? So I suggest strongly, if you try to do this, that you try these formulas with different numbers of regions in order to, well, fine-tune what is for you the best balance between the number of regions and the number of expenditure items. And it's very clear how. Basically, you based on your national and regional organization, you know how much it costs to you to select another location or another region, and how much it costs to you to select one additional item within one region. And based on this balance between the different costs, you can find what is the ideal balance for you, the one that minimizes your cost and still is able to produce reliable results, okay? So for some of you, if the cost of going to one location is very high, you prefer to minimize the number of locations and increase a little bit the number of invoices. If visiting a new location, which is very much in the neighborhoods, maybe it's not high, in that case, you may prefer to increase the number of locations, but with that, reduce the number of items that you have to audit at the final stage. Once your sample is selected, you have to project the errors from the sample to the population. As usual, the only novelty here is that now, instead of the traditional 2 steps of subsampling, you have 3 steps. So follow me. Within each location, you have a sample of invoices, expenditure items. The invoices within each location are used to, in this bottom-up strategy, are used to project the error or the error weights of each location. Once you have all the error weights of the locations or the regions projected, you use these error weights of the locations to project the error weights of the operations. And once the error weights of the operations or the error amounts are projected, then you use, as usual, the sample of operations to project the errors of the population, okay? The same strategy as for subsampling, but now with 3 steps. In terms of precision, we have some formulas now to calculate precision at operation level. This is important because the application of this methodology is still in the beginning, and we would like to see the level of precision at operation level. But the good thing is that if everything is correctly done, the methodology has again been designed in such a way that the contribution of the subsampling for the global precision is negligible. And this means, again, which are very good news, that you can calculate precision as usual. You can even use the normal templates for precision calculation, feeding in the errors of the operations as if they were the true errors of the operations, although you know that they are not, they are errors that are projected through this chain. Okay, so a very fast numerical example, just not going into details in the calculation, but just for you to get a feeling of this. I have a population with a book value of 1 million to simplify the presentation, and I have 40 locations here. And I have a confidence level of 90%, anticipated error rate is 0.5%. I have some data here, and imagine that the audit authority decided to work with 5 regions out of the 40. Very convenient. Instead of letting the sample to cover the 40, I will concentrate audit activities over 5 regions. I have used these formulas for calculating the sample size, and I found that the sample size that I would need to cover in terms of invoices per region, if I want to work with 5 regions, is 20 invoices per region. It means in total that I can do this work by auditing 100 invoices divided in 5 locations and auditing 20 invoices in each location. Now, is it good or a bad decision? Depends on your structure of costs and you want to do. One thing is for sure, I have calculated the same sample size without regional clustering. Imagine that we don't perform any regional clustering and that we allow the sample to cover the 40 regions. If I do this, the sample size that I would achieve is 77. Now, what is better? Depends on you. Do we prefer to audit 100 invoices concentrated in 5 regions, or do we prefer to audit 77 invoices that may be spread over 40 regions? So it's up to you to understand if this increase of 23 invoices is of not in your benefit. I would say in general, depend. Thinking about a normal structure, a cost structure in terms of audit, probably this makes sense. So there was a significant advantage by significantly reducing the number of places that you have to audit, although to do that, of course, you have to compensate it by increasing a little bit your final sample size. Final graph in this presentation, just to show you a little bit in this example, what is the relationship between the number of invoices that you have to audit and the number of locations, and you can very easily understand what happens. If you do this without any restriction, if you allow your sample to be spread over the 40 locations, you have this 77 sample size. If you decide to work with 5 locations, if you remember, I got a sample size of 100 in total. And you see this picture. If you decide to work with just 3 locations, well, the sample size is even larger. It's 120, I don't know, 128 or so. So what happens? Once you start increasing the number of locations that you would like to visit, your global sample size per operation tends to go down. But to be honest, there's a moment after which there's almost no additional gain. To be honest, auditing 15 locations or auditing 40 locations almost gives you the same sample size, okay? One is 77 and the other is slightly above 80, so it's basically the same thing, only for very small number of locations, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I don't know, until 10 probably, you see some relevant increase in the final sample size in relation to what you would have if you would not introduce any restriction in terms of the number of locations that you like to audit. And that's it. Of course, without any technical details, general overview of what is regional clustering and how can be used in your benefit, both for the ending and the new programming period. So again, as usual, by the end of topic, a stop to make room for any comments or questions. No questions? So first topic for which you don't have questions. Yes, are the regions chosen randomly? Francesco Piron, yes, but you can, if you prefer to select them with equal probabilities or with probability proportional to expenditure. So this depends on the strategy. If you have some regions that are much larger than the others, you may use unequal probabilities. In other cases, you use equal probability. There is also another thing that I have not presented here, but it's possible. You may even decide that you want to stratify the locations, but then if you stratify the locations, then this increases the minimum number of locations. I don't know. Imagine this is west and east. You may decide that you want to do a stratification here, so you choose 2 locations from the west and 2 locations from the east. This is possible, but it has a price to pay, because whenever you stratify, usually we ask you to have at least 3 items per stratum. The procedure is suitable for larger recipients who invoice personnel expenses at several locations. For example, should the region be defined by NUTS code or address? It's up to you. It's what is more convenient. I would say each problem is a different one. There is no restriction in terms how do you organize your regions. It may even happen that for your convenience, your regions do not correspond at all to administrative regions of your state. Does not matter. It's whatever. It's a good organization. It makes sense for you in terms of organization of your field work. Do you have to apply regional cluster, or you? I think you may choose not to. Yes, of course, you may choose not to. This is optional, and this has been created in response of the need of some audit authorities that were desperately needing this, and there were also already some audit authorities that were already trying to implement it without a guideline. And of course, to avoid that each one implements a completely different methodology in terms of regional clustering, we decide to propose a standard methodology that all of you can use. Good. Anything else? Is it useful? You can answer in the chat. Yes, Francesco Piron, thank you very much. At least for some of you, it's useful. Well, this is mostly for member states where there are regions. Of course, this may be very, very useful. Good. Proportional control arrangements, or as we call it for the post-2020, single audit arrangements. Again, a completely transversal topic. It's not related. So many of the things that I'm going to talk from now until the end are not really simpling methods, are not really simpling methodology, are basically the framework in which the sampling methods have to be applied, okay? And proportional control arrangements
have some technical details, but basically result from some political decisions. So let me start with the 14-20 programming period. You all or many of you remember that in this period, these proportional control arrangements conditions were established to facilitate the administrative burden of the beneficiaries, to avoid that some beneficiaries are audited several times by different bodies. And because of this, some rules have been set. I'm going to avoid to read all of this in much detail, but let me try to get the spirit of it, which is operations whose eligible expenditure does not exceed certain thresholds. These thresholds vary with the funds. For instance, for ERDF and cohesion fund, it's 400,000 euros. These vary a little bit with the funds, but for these operations that, let me call it for simplification of the explanation, small operations. For these small operations, they cannot be subject to more than one audit prior to the submission of the accounts for the accounting year in which operation is completed. So in other words, they cannot be audited more than once during the whole programming period. Other operations, even the ones that exceed these thresholds in terms of eligible expenditure, should not be subject to more than one audit per accounting year, either by the audit authority or the commission. And we even have a final rule that says, okay, and operations that have been already audited in a certain year by the European Court of Auditors should also not be audited, provided that, which it's not often the case, but provided that the results of the audit of the Court of Auditors can be used by the audit authority or by the commission for the purpose of their own tasks. Okay, this is what we have called by that time the proportional control arrangements. There are then some variations of these. I'm just going to read you the global framework. We have some derogation of the above setup, and these derogations establish an intermediate level of expenditure. So we say that, well, for instance, in ERDF, for operations that whose expenditure is really below this threshold of 400,000, but if they are above 200,000, so let's say an intermediate level, they still may be subject to more than one audit if you, audit authorities, consider that, well, it's not really possible to draw a reliable audit opinion without auditing these operations. So you still have this buffer of intermediate value in the case of ERDF, just for the explanation, between 200 and 400,000 euros, where you still can do this audit. Then we have even more broad rules to say, well, but you audit authorities or the commission may still, independently on the level of expenditure, whatever is level of expenditure, you may still carry out some audits over these operations, even if they are very small, under certain conditions. And the conditions are that under a certain risk assessment, you have established a certain specific risk of irregularity or even fraud for this operation. In case you have spotted what you consider to be serious deficiencies in the management and control systems, and also in this period referred in Article 141, so a period of 3 years following the submission of the accounts. Under all these three conditions, you still may audit these operations, but you should have a clear proof that you are under these conditions. Last comment regarding proportional control arrangements is that for operational programs for which the most recent audit opinion indicates that there are no significant deficiencies, the Commission may also agree with the audit authority that the level of audit work required may be reduced so it's proportionate to the risk that has been established. So this is the context of proportional control arrangements. A point of extreme importance that has been used by maybe not all, but many audit authorities. One thing is to say that the operation, any operation independently of the expenditure, should not be subject to more than one audit per accounting year by the audit authority or the Commission in order to avoid this overburden. A different thing is the context of a multi-period sampling approach. In the context of a multi-period approach, when in the first period of the year you visit a certain beneficiary to audit a certain operation, you are not auditing the full expenditure of the operation that year. You are just auditing the expenditure related to a part of the year. So in a multi-period approach, we consider that the audit authority may also consider that the audit of that operation is performed in 2 or more stages, in 2 or more periods, okay? So if one operation was selected for the sample in one sample period of the year, you can keep that operation in the population to be sampled and audited in the following sampling periods of the accounting year. And our argument in this regard is that these are not 2 audits. This is just one single audit, which audit work is spread over different moments of the same year. So this is a different thing. And this is it. Now, what are the technical details or consequences of this? This creates to us a challenge. And why? First of all, because as you very well know, even by regulation, all the when you issue an audit opinion, this audit opinion has to concern the whole declared expenditure to the Commission. And this creates a kind of contradiction. In one hand, it is absolutely mandatory that your opinion covers the whole declared expenditure. On the other hand, you have been forbidden to audit a part of the expenditure. So how can we say that our opinion is also covering the expenditure pertaining to operations whose audit is, let me use this word, forbidden in this specific year? And this is the methodology that we have developed for the proportional control arrangements, is really addressing this issue. And basically, and very simply, it will, in the samples, either replace or exclude the units that cannot be audited because they are under the conditions of Article 148 of the CPR. So, if for the sample selection, imagine that you have some units under this condition, if for sample selection, these units are still in your file from which you select the sample, this originates what we call the replacement approach, which is potentially these units under Article 148 may fall into your sample, but if they fall into your sample, they have to be replaced because it's forbidden to audit them. Other possibility, you sample directly from what we call the reduced population. I mean, from the very beginning, you exclude these operations from your population. When you select the sample, you are selecting the sample from a clean population without these units. Let me call it the reduced population. And in this case, this results in what in the guidance note on sampling we call the exclusion approach, in the sense that these units from scratch have been excluded, from the population. Now, in case of replacement, these sample units, if they have been selected to the sample, they have to be replaced. And they have to be replaced by an additional sample with equal size. Example, imagine that you have selected 2 units that are affected by Article 148 to your sample. If these 2 units have been selected, you have to replace them by 2 additional units that are free to be audited, okay? This is the replacement approach. Very importantly, the replacement units have to be selected using exactly the same methodology as for the original sample. Of course, it would be extremely confusing and technically very difficult that you are going to select these units with a different methodology, okay? That would be extremely difficult. In the case of both replacement and exclusion, whatever is your methodology, the sample size is suggested to be calculated based on the population parameters corresponding to the original population, okay? So corresponding to the population, including these units affected by Article 148.1 of the CPR. So in practical terms, it means that the calculation of the sample size is made exactly in the same way. Either you have replacement or you have exclusion. So imagine that you have selected these units, either with replacement or exclusion. You are going to avoid the audit of these units. Then how do you project the errors to the population? Well, the projection of the errors has some particularity because you have this very annoying problem of having to have an opinion about the full expenditure of the population, including the units that have been excluded. So you need to calculate the total error for the expenditure declared, whole expenditure declared, including these expenditures. So how can we do that? You have 2 ways. Microphone. You have 2 ways. One is to project the errors to the original population. So let me call it the enlarged population. And the other approach is to project the errors to the reduced population. Now, how do we project the errors for the enlarged population? Well, very simple. When you project the errors, in the formulas for projecting the errors, the population size, capital N, and the population book value, what we represent by BV, are the ones corresponding to the original population. So it's very important that when you calculate project the errors, you consider the parameters of the original population. This is the customary approach if you are using the replacement approach. Why? Because if you are using the replacement approach, all the operations are included in the file of the population, and automatically, even if you are using some kind of software, the software will consider the whole population, including the whole book value and the whole population size. If you are using the exclusion approach, your file from where you are selecting your operations is the file of the reduced population. And even if you are using a software, the software does not guess that you have manually extracted some units, and so the software will project the errors to the reduced population. So if the errors are projected to the reduced population by using the population size and the book value of the reduced population, how can then we convert this projection that is automatically done to the reduced population? How can we convert it to the original population? Because our obligation is to have one opinion about the whole population. Well, after projecting the error that you have projected using the normal formulas, the normal templates, will have, after it has been calculated by a software or by Excel, you have very often yourselves to multiply this projected error amount by the ratio between the book value of the original population and the book value of the reduced population in order to enlarge the projected error to the original population. This multiplication by the ratio of the book values is the standard rule to use if you are using MUS or if you are using simple random sampling with ratio estimation. Nevertheless, in case you are using simple random sampling with mean per unit estimation, the way to convert the projected error from the reduced population to the original population is no longer by multiplying it by the ratio of the book values, but rather multiplying it by the ratio of the population sizes. So how many operations do I have in the enlarged population, original population, and in the denominator, how many operations do I have in the reduced population? So in one way or the other, you can check that we are projecting the errors to the whole expenditure of the population and avoiding to fall into this trap, which is that because it's forbidden to audit some operations, we would just be projecting the errors to the reduced population. What happens in terms of precision? Well, in what regards the precision, the idea is more or less the same. Either you calculate the precision on the base of the original population, using the parameters of the original population. This is typical in the replacement approach. Or if you are using the exclusion approach, very much your templates will produce the precision for the reduced population. And again, you have to enlarge this precision manually using exactly the same methodology. If you are using MUS or simple random sampling with ratio estimation, you multiply the precision that you have just calculated by the ratio between the book values. If you are using simple random sampling with mean per unit estimation, you have to multiply the precision that you have obtained by the ratio of the population sizes. Okay, that's it. And what is important to tell is that in the guidance note on sampling, that it's still useful and applicable, you have a very complete summary, a table with the recommended approach for each sampling method, all the options that are available and what we should do within each option. Just for the sake of the example, just to motivate you to see that everything is there, you have this kind of table. This table is repeated for all the sampling methods, but for instance, for MUS standard method, you have a column for exclusion approach, a column for replacement approach, and you have information about what are the parameters that you have population for sample size, how do we select the sample here from the reduced population, here from the original population, and then how do you project the errors from the sample into the population by using these, let's say, these correction coefficients that I have just told you about. It's important to read these tables because depending on the methods, this may be a little more complicated than it seems here in my simplistic explanation. Why? Because under certain methods like MUS, as you very well know, we have both high value stratum and low value stratum, which means that even if in a high value stratum, although this high value stratum is in theory exhaustively observed, if some operations of the high value stratum are affected by this principle of proportional control arrangements, it will happen that this correction also needs to be performed in the high value stratum. Okay, and I have brought here two numerical examples that put these ideas in perspective. First example, imagine, let me exemplify exclusion. So the units are taken away from the population, applied with MUS. I have this population, 3,852 operations with this expenditure, confidence level of 90%. Imagine that 4 operations are affected by these provisions of proportional control arrangements. Their total book value is 12.7 million euros, okay? And they are going to be manually excluded, these 4, from the population to be sampled. I calculate sample size as usual. By the way, please remember that for the sample size, I use the data from the original sample. So this is the original book value. I don't know, standard deviation and anticipated errors probably come from a pilot sample or something. Doesn't matter, just for the sake of the illustration, imagine that I got a sample size of 93. Now, under MUS, as many of you know, you have to establish the cutoff of the high value items. In my case, the cutoff is the book value divided by the sample size, so it's 45 million euros. This means that all units above this cutoff have to be manually moved to the high value stratum. And in this case, we had 6 units that are high value ones with this total expenditure. And now a new piece of information, we have to check where the excluded units are. And I have checked that the 4 excluded units have expenditure below this threshold. So this means that the 4 excluded units are in the, let me call it, low value or sampling stratum. Now, how do you calculate the sampling interval in the sampling stratum? Well, the sampling interval in the sampling stratum is the book value of the reduced population after taking away the book values of the 4 excluded units minus the book value of the 6 units that belong to the high value stratum divided by the sample size of the sampling stratum. And here it is, the sampling interval is whatever it is, 41 million. And then you select the sample of 87 operations. And then you project the errors as usual. All of you probably remember how to project the errors. You just sum the error weights and multiply by the sampling interval, and you get the total projected error in the sampling stratum. By the way, for the high value stratum, I had 6 high value operations, 3 of those with errors, and the total error amounted 7.6 million euros. So in total, I have a projected error in the high value stratum of 7 million and a projected error in the sampling stratum of 42.4 million. Nevertheless, we have a problem, which is in the sampling stratum, there are 4 units that have been previously excluded due to these provisions of proportional control arrangements. This means that the projected error of the sampling stratum, which is 42.4 million euros, it's only projecting the errors to the reduced population, is not projecting the errors to the whole population as the regulations foresee. So in that case, we have to introduce this correction factor that I told you about a few minutes ago, which is to take the projected error that comes out of the software, in my case 42.4 million, and multiply it by the ratio between the book value of the original population and the book value of the reduced population. In my example, let's be honest, because we just had 4 excluded units, the difference is not major, but still there is some difference, which is instead of having a projected error of 42.4 million euros, now I have a projected error of 42.6 million euros. Okay, small difference, but in some cases, as we all know or suspect, it can be significant. Then we calculate the total projected error. How much is the total projected error? Error found in the exhaustive stratum plus the error projected in the sampling stratum after being enlarged to the original population, 50 million euros. If you want to have the error weight, you multiply this by the original population book value, 1.2%, and it's done. And then you have to calculate precision. Again, in the precision, we have a problem because if you are using Excel or any other software, the software does not guess what we have done. And the software will use, in the calculation of precision, the book value of the reduced population, which in my example, after calculation, was 52.8 million euros. And after this is performed, we have to manually amplify this precision by, again, multiplying it by the ratios of the book values. And instead of 52.8 million euros. Now I have 53.0 million euros, and it's done. My work is done, okay? And then I will draw my audit opinion based on these results. So this is one first example with MUS and in my example exclusion. Let me now create a completely new example, also with MUS, but with replacement and a situation where the units affected by these principles are in the high value stratum, which is also a particular case. So again, the same population. Imagine a sample size of 30 operations with a high value stratum of 8 operations. And imagine that among the 8 operations of the high value stratum, there is one that is affected by this principle. So although the MUS methodology tells me that it is mandatory to audit the 8 operations that are in the high value stratum, in practical terms, I cannot do so because one of them it's out of my possibilities. So I will have just to audit 7. Now, follow me, ladies and gentlemen. My sample should be 8 units in the high value stratum plus 22 in the low value stratum to have the 30 units in my sample. But because now I know that one of these 8 units is affected by these principles and I can only audit 7, before I select the sample of the sampling stratum, I have to enlarge it from 22 to 23, so I comply with the foreseen sample size of 30, okay? So this problem of proportional control arrangements may also lead to the fact that I have to do some manual corrections in the allocation of the sample size. Okay, and that's it. There is no need to produce any replacement because there's nothing to replace. I have already compensated this unit by selecting one more in the low value stratum. What would happen if I would not have spotted this in advance and I have already selected 22 units in the sampling stratum? The moment where I see, oh, I can only audit 7 in the high value stratum is the moment where I have already selected this 22. Well, no problem. If I have already selected this 22, I will have to go back to this sampling stratum and I will have to select one additional unit using MUS methodology. So the methodology that you use is the same methodology that is usually used for additional samples, or in the situation where you have a pilot sample and then you have to complement it, which is go again to the same population, exclude the 22 units that have already been selected, of course, and go through that population and select one additional unit in order to create the full sample of 30 items. Good news, once this is done, you can project the errors in the low value stratum as usual, summing of the error weights, multiplying by the sampling interval over these 23 units. What about the exhaustive stratum? Well, for the exhaustive stratum, we may have some problem because in the exhaustive stratum, we have only audited 7 operations out of the 8 that should have been audited. What does it mean? It means that although there is no projection here, although this is in theory an exhaustive stratum, there is still a correction that needs to be implemented manually, which is the following. The error that you have found in the exhaustive stratum, which is basically the sum of the errors of the 7 high-value items that are in this stratum, has again to be multiplied by the ratio of the book values between the original and the reduced population in this stratum. And by doing this, in my example, I would have to increase the projected error from 420 euros or 1,000 euros or whatever it is to 492 in order to compensate for this unit that was not possible to audit. Once this is done, the total projected error is the error found in the sampling stratum plus the error projected in the exhaustive stratum, and the precision in this case can be calculated as usual because the only stratum that was affected, it was the exhaustive stratum, and the exhaustive stratum does not contribute to the calculation of precision. So in this case, it can be calculated as usual. So as you can see, although the general methodology is very easy to understand, then there are many practical details for us not to make any errors when projecting these results in the context of proportional control arrangements. Some final words about the post-2020. What do we have for the post-2020? Well, again, we have thresholds, operations whose total eligible expenditure does not exceed, again, 400,000 for the RDF and cohesion fund, 300,000 for ESF plus, and so on. You have here these thresholds, again, shall not be subject to more than one audit prior to the submission of the account of the accounting year in which the operation is completed. So again, it means just one audit for the programming period. And to be honest, no changes are foreseen for the application of the current methodology. So this is particularly important because these proportional control arrangements has always been a matter of confusion on how exactly to perform this, and the confusions, if they exist, they will continue to exist potentially in the future, because for the post-2020, we have exactly the same situation as we had in the 14-20 programming period. Okay, this is it. So another stop for any questions or comments. So let me go from bottom to up. In the case of a stratified MUS method, what if the excluded operation is part of a fully verified stratum and we do not calculate total error rate for that stratum? Well, in fact, we calculate. It's the same thing as for the high value stratum. Imagine that you have a stratum that is fully observed, either because it's a high value stratum or for any other criteria. You decided that you have a group of the population that you want to observe exhaustive. You have 10 operations in this group, 2 of them affected by proportional control arrangements, which means that you can only audit 8. You just observe the error of these 8, you sum the errors of these 8, and then you have to project this error from the 8 to the 10 by multiplying whatever error you have observed by this ratio that I showed you here, which is the ratio of the total book value of this exhaustive group before excluding the 2 operations and the book value of this exhaustive group after excluding these 2 operations. Okay, the idea is always the same. Anything else? Is it in 21-27 still so that for operations running several years, you have to sum up the early amounts and then check if the amount is under 300,000, for example? Yes, I believe so. Barbara, no changes foreseen. Yes.
I see now that in our guidelines note, we have clarification on page 222 to decide whether this article applies. The assessment of the level of the total eligible expenditure is to be done on the basis of the amount in the grant agreement, as the exact expenditure that will be declared during the programming period is not known in advance. I'm not aware of any other clarifications or guidelines in this regard.
But this is still true for the current programming period, for the ending programming period. It can be done over the grant agreements. Article 80 concerns, this is articles. In the second approach, exclusion approach, total error rate is calculated to the decreased population. Yes, index Simona Bukur, for the second approach, the total error rate is automatically calculated for the reduced population, and then it's your job to convert this figure into a figure that is representative of the original population by applying those ratios as you have seen in the examples. Very well. 188, 148, replacement. Well, Francesco Piron, in the replacement approach, the sample size, not really, because we have requested that whatever is the methodology that you use, you always calculate the sample size with the parameters of the original population. So basically, it's the same, and I think that's it. Any additional comments or questions? So we are progressively entering into more confusing stuff. Next topic is subsampling with simplified cost option. Second. Okay. I'm going to try to stabilize the quality of my network. Let's see if it's better now. So, ladies and gentlemen, subsampling with simplified cost options. First of all, you all know that simplified cost options are a specific category of costs. In this case, the eligible costs are calculated based on the predefined methodology, typically based on outputs, results, or even other standard costs. They can be used in the case of grants and repayable assistance. I have copy-paste here a long sentence. To be honest, I don't even remember from which document, that clearly states that the simplified cost option is something that represents a departure from the requirement of tracing every euro of confinance expenditure. So contrary to the principle of real costs, here the flat weights or standard scale or unit costs and lump sums are defined ex ante based on some calculations, and eligible costs of a project are calculating by applying very often a fixed percentage, a certain flat weight, to some other costs, or even a fixed price, like in the lump sums, okay, based on some outputs that have been reached, or some inputs. You know this context of simplified cost options. You know that there are different types of simplified cost options. In fact, we can group them in two completely different groups. Well, completely different for the sake of the sampling methodologies. One corresponds to standard cost options whose value does not depend on the value of real cost items. So here we have basically the lump sums and unit costs. And then you have all the old ones whose value depends on the value of some real cost items. And here we have the flat weights. For instance, standard cost option item is simply 20% of the value of some real cost item. We all know that the purpose of subsampling is to calculate the error of the main sampling unit. So then the main sampling unit error can be projected into the population without having to audit the full expenditure of this main sampling unit. This means that the errors associated to standard cost options also have to be evaluated independent of their risk. Even if we all consider that their risk is lower than for other categories of costs, they still have to be part of the population and part of the extrapolation process. Nevertheless, the way we decide to sample and to audit and even to project the errors of these standard cost options vary significantly with the nature of the costs, and basically they vary significantly under these two options. Cases where they depend on real costs, and cases where they do not depend on the value of real cost item. So let me start with, let's address two cases. First case is the case where the standard cost options are based on a flat rate applied to real costs. In this context, we still have two sub-problems, two sub-options. One option is, although this is a flat rate, it's a flat rate based on all other expenditure items of the project. There are situations where this happens. That we have here an example based on direct staff costs with no other real costs in accordance with the ESF regulation, or flat rate for indirect costs based on the total direct cost pursuant the articles 68(1)(a) of the CPR. So basically what it means is a situation where the standard cost option is a percentage of all the real cost items. The second sub-case, let me call it like that, is a situation where the flat rate is based only on some types of other expenditure items of the project. Very more common in ERDF projects, where you have a flat rate for indirect costs that, for instance, is based on direct staff costs. So either this flat rate is applicable to all other real cost items or just a part of the other real cost items. This generates different ways to audit and to project the errors of these standard cost options. So how to do it? Let me start with this situation, which is the situation where the flat rate is based on all other expenditure of the project. If the flat rate is based on all other expenditure of the project, the subsample may be taken from the population of the real costs. So you don't need to include the standard cost options in the population file from which you select the sample. You are just going to select the sample directly from the list of the items corresponding to real costs. Then, from this subsample, you project the error of the real costs. Of course, this is just a population of real costs, and you project the error of the real costs to the expenditure of the operation. And this, of course, until this moment, excludes the value of standard cost options. Once you have projected this error amount to the operation, you can obtain the error for the whole operation, including the standard cost options, by recalculating the error with the operation flat rate. So the real costs plus the flat rate. In practical terms, this is very simple. This is just multiplying the projected error rate by the total expenditure of the population, including standard cost options. Example, you have an operation of, let me use very unrealistic examples, but just for to see the methodology. You have an operation with 140 euros, being 100 real costs and 40 a flat rate. If this flat rate depends on all the real costs, on the 100 euros of real costs, what you are going to do is to do a subsample from the 100 euros. You projected an error from there. Imagine that you have projected an error of 20 euros. If you project an error of 20 euros in an operation of 100, your error rate is 20%. This error rate has been calculated solely on the base of the real cost items. And now what you have to do is to multiply this error rate by the whole expenditure of the population, including the flat rate. And this gives you that the total error amount of this operation is 28 euros and not 20 euros, as it has been projected from the real cost. Okay, this is it for the situation where the flat rate is based on all the other expenditure of the project. A different situation is the one where the flat rate is based only on some types of other expenditure of the project. So you can still select your sample from the real cost items. This is still a possibility. Nevertheless, before the selection takes place, you have to previously add the flat rate percentage to the items that are affected by this flat rate, but only these items, because we are under a situation where not all the items are affected by the flat rate. This is, by the way, of particular importance if you are using MUS, for example, because as you know, MUS selection has a selection probability that depends on the expenditure of the item. So it's important that before the selection of the sample takes place, the expenditure of the item is corrected by the amount of the flat rate. So the selection of the sample really follows the principles of MUS. Of course, that is also important for simple random sampling in order to avoid errors in the projection process, but of course is of particular importance under MUS. Example that illustrates the idea. I have an operation with an expenditure of 2,600 euros. And let me decompose it like this. 300 euros of costs, which are not at all a base for the flat rate. Imagine 3 items, one with 50 euros, another with 50 euros, and another one with 200 euros, 300 euros. Then I have 2,000 euros, which are the base for the flat rate. And in these 2,000 euros, imagine that I have 2 items, each one with 1,000 euros. And finally, I have 300 euros of flat rate costs, which are based on the 2,000 euros that we have mentioned here. And it's based on a flat rate of 15%. So 15% of 2,000 is 300 euros. So in total, 2,600. Nevertheless, for the sake of selecting the sample, probably the most simple way to do it is to list just 6 expenditure items. So before that, sorry, just to list all the items. We have 6 items. These 3 ones that do not depend on the flat rate, these 2 ones that are the base for flat rate, and this one that is the flat rate. But for the sake of selecting a sample, for the sake of constituting a population to select a sample, it's more practical to still just use the list of the real cost items. So the first 5 are the real cost items. So in the file, I will just place these 5 real cost items with this particularity. The first 3 are placed with their own expenditure because they are not a base for a flat rate. The other 2 are placed in the file, but I will add to their individual expenditure the value of the flat rate. So instead of putting these 2 in the file with an expenditure of 1,000, I will put 1,000 plus 15%, so 1,150 euros each one of them. Now I have 5 real cost items. 2 of them have been corrected by the flat rate, but they all together correspond to the total expenditure of the population. And now you just select the sample and you project the error. And if an error is detected in any of these 2 items that have this enlarged expenditure, so that have this component of the real cost and the flat rate, you need, of course, to increase the error that you found in this item by 15% in order to reflect the flat rate. Example, you have found an error of 100 euros in the real cost item of 1,000 euros. The amount to be inputted as an error for this item is not 100, but 115. 100 plus 15% of 100, so 115 euros over this subsample unit of 1,150 euros. In practical terms, it means that the error rate of the item is calculated based on the errors found among the 1,000 euros, but the total amount of error has to be enlarged by the flat rate. How to project the errors then? Once you have set the values of the errors for each one of the units in the sample. Then you project the errors as usual. Well, let's not go into detail. If you are using equal probability selection, you either use mean period estimation or ratio estimation. Please remember that the errors that will be projected in these formulas, some of them are the errors that the auditor really has found, but in other cases, these are the errors that have been amplified by this flat rate, as in this example of the 1,000 euros that I have told you about. If you are using MUS, again, you use the formulas of MUS, where, again, the errors that appear in these formulas may have to be enlarged in situations where you have found the error in a real cost item that is a base for a flat rate. And that's it. Final situation, the situation where the standard cost options are not based on real costs. Situation typical where they correspond to lump sums or unit costs. In this case, it's pretty clear what to do. They are honest items that can be included in the population. So these items should not be excluded from the sampling population because they usually have lower risk than the others. It's a good practice, although not mandatory, but it's a good practice to do a stratification where you have a separate stratum for the standard cost options and a separate stratum for the real cost items, and maybe a high value stratum and other features that you may consider to include in these sampling designs. So if you stratify, it's good because the extrapolation is carried out separately for each stratum, and the error weight of the standard cost options has no impact on the error weight of the real cost items, and vice versa. And you have then an extrapolated error for the standard cost options. You have an extrapolated error for the real cost items, and the total error is just the sum of these two components, as usual in any stratification. Talking about standard cost options, it makes sense now to make a connection to technical assistance based on flat rates, because of course there is a connection between these and the examples that we have seen before, where the standard cost options are based on flat rates. So what still in 2014-20, what can you say in terms of technical assistance flat rates? First of all, the overall amount to be reimbursed for operations financed in the axis concerning technical assistance may be calculated as a flat rate of the amounts of expenditure of the operations and the priority axis of the program, other than the one concerning technical assistance. In the case of EAFRD, technical assistance may be calculated as a flat rate of the amounts of expenditure of operations under the rural development measures. In any case, what you are saying is that there is a base of flat rate for these technical assistance. As you know, in this programming period, this flat rate is established at 4% for ERDF, ESF, Cohesion Fund, EAFRD, and 6% for the programs supported by EMFF. And for programs supported by ERDF under the ETC, the flat rate is established at 6%. So we have a situation where we may have different flat rates. Why is this relevant? Whenever the technical assistance is treated as a flat rate in these situations, you can select the sample without the technical assistance in exactly the same way we have seen for standard cost options. So the error itself can be projected exactly in the same way we have seen for standard cost options, which values depend on the value of real cost items. You have seen the methodology for doing that. You project the errors to the real cost items, and then the error is enlarged by the percentage of the flat rate. So nothing new here, is basically the same thing. If the work is done over one individual operational program, then this technical assistance is either a flat rate or non-flat rate type. It's not problematic. But in case you are working with a group of programs, then we may have some technical problems. Why? Because it may happen that some programs in the group use the flat rate approach, while others do not use the flat rate approach. And in this case, if you are in the same group mixing programs, some with a flat rate approach and others without a flat rate approach, is recommended, again, that you stratify your sample into two strata. One strata corresponding to the programs using the flat rate basis, and the other corresponding to the programs that do not use the flat rate basis. This is what we consider a good practice, but it's not obligatory to do this stratification. If you do this stratification, everything is very simple, because for each stratum, either you have flat rate or you don't have flat rate. If you do not stratify, in case your group includes this situation, I mean, a part of the population with flat rate and a part without flat rate, or even a situation where a part of the population is governed by a certain flat rate, let's say of 4%, and another one is governed by a flat rate of 6%, of course, then in both cases you have this mixture of situations. And again, it is in any case, as I said, recommended to stratify these groups. But the bottom line is this: because stratification, although recommended, is not mandatory, if you have a situation where you have not used stratification, you have to find a way to project the errors from the sample to the population, knowing that potentially there are some items that are not affected by the flat rate, there are items that are affected by the flat rate, and there may even be items that are affected by different flat rates. And in this case, what we suggest is that you project the errors as prescribed for the case of simplified cost options, whose flat rate depends only on some types of the expenditure of the project. So for each real cost item individually, you enlarge it by the corresponding flat rate if that flat rate is applicable to that item. This is an option. Or the Commission has opened the door for a simplified approach, where in this case the extrapolation is totally done over the population, excluding technical assistant. So we forget technical assistant and we do this all without technical assistant. And once you have projected the total error rate that you have projected for this population without technical assistant, this error rate will also be considered representative of the population, including the amount of the flat rate. So the total, of course, amount of error has to be enlarged by the percentage of the flat rate. And that's it. Very shortly, I know, and in a glance, everything about standard cost options and the current situation regarding technical assistant flat rates. We are about to have a break, and after the break, we talk about technical assistant in the post-2020. But again, as usual, a pit stop for questions regarding standard cost options. No questions? Does it mean that we are entering the zone of very clear topics or very unclear topics? I'll give you one more minute to check if you have any comment or question. If not, ladies and gentlemen, we resume at... you have a question. Yes, please go ahead. You can open the microphone if you prefer. The flat rate has thus to be corrected as the same percentage as the error we found in the sample. If I understand well, under this, the question under this simplified approach, the flat rate is correcting the same percentage as the error projected from the sample of selected, excluding the flat rates. Please, Barbara, if there is something to add to what I have said, please complement me.
In the new programming period, there will be a new situation that the member states will not be declaring flat rate, that the flat rate will be automatically added by the SFC system. So in some situations, it will be very clear. You will have audit population covering one or more programs, hopefully with the same flat rate. And then you simply calculate everything without flat rate and automatically it will be added in SFC. Now you could have, unfortunately, the very complex situation that some of the population, some programs will have flat rate, the other will not have, or different rates. In such situation, I propose that you contact us, that we clarify in detail, because it would be too complex within the framework of this seminar to cover this issue.
Welcome. Any additional question? Okay, then we come back at 4:20. See you later. We are ready for the very final part of our seminar today. And this part appears, of course, in the sequence of the last topic before the break. So, for technical assistance. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we are doing now is just to highlight some details about technical assistance for the 21-27 programming period. Let me just check the chat just to be sure that you don't have any additional questions regarding the previous part. Okay. So, just a few comments on the post-2020. First of all, for the post-2020, the technical assistance flat rate will remain as part of the sampling population, but from a practical point of view, the sample selection takes place from the, may I call it again, reduced population, the population without the technical assistance flat rate amount, okay? As in the current programming period. So this is still the same thing. In what the principle is basically the same. Regarding the calculation of the total error rate, in the first stage, as we have seen before the break, the projection of the errors takes place on the basis of the expenditure of the population, excluding the technical assistance, as in practical terms, the sample is selected from the population without the technical assistance. Then you calculate a certain error rate, a certain projected error rate. The projected error rate that is obtained for such a population is also considered as the error rate for the population, including the amount of flat rate technical assistance, okay? So it's basically the same thing. You have the error rate that should be applied to the whole expenditure of the population, including the flat rate. So in what regards the error rate, nothing new. It's absolutely, I think, crystal clear after having discussed this so detailed before the break. For something a little bit of concern that I have not yet addressed, the residual error rate. in fact, we also have to calculate the residual error rate in situations where we have this technical assistance flat rate. So, as for the total error rate, the residual error rate is to be calculated in a first stage based on the values of the population without the technical assistance flat rate. So let me call it again, reduced population. And this means that in the table that I believe many of you know very well, which is the table that you use to look into the residual error rate, the residual amount at risk, and also a table that automatically calculates to you in line L what is the amount of correction that is still needed to reduce the residual risk to the materiality level. In a table like this, all these things, audit population, or things under under the E and H lines, I mean the amounts under ongoing assessment, the negative amounts detecting expenditure originally declared, and the financial corrections that have been implemented in relation to the errors detected either by the audit authority or by other bodies. All of this will relate to the population in the first stage, to the population without the flat rate. If the residual error rate in line K is still above 2%, in situation that is above 2%, then the template will calculate under line L the amount of financial correction that is needed to bring the residual error rate to below 2%. This correction in line L, of course, based on what we have said, does not include the proportion of technical assistance expenditure. As Ms. Barbara Koschak said just before the break, for the 21-27 period, the proportion of technical assistance expenditure will be automatically reflected by the SFC 2021 in the accounts in which the financial correction was implemented. This means that in the new programming period, the total technical assistance flat rate is not inputted manually by the member state, but calculated automatically in this system. So if we just have one flat rate, this correction is done automatically by considering automatic in this system the correction by the amount of error rate. So no problem here. Again, the most complex situation is the situation similar to one that we have seen before the break, where we have a residual error rate above 2%, and this error rate is covering a group of programs that either use different flat rates or a situation where, as we have seen before the break, only some of them use the flat rates, and we have this mixed situation of zero error rate and possibly two different levels of error rate for the technical assistance. What to do in this case? Again, first we calculate the total error rate and the residual error rate without the technical assistance, as we have just seen. Let me call these the amounts one. One is without the technical assistance. Based on this, we will get the amount of financial correction that has to be deducted from the population without the technical assistance flat rate that was under line L. And this amount will be multiplied by the ratio of the total population expenditure with the technical assistance flat rate and the total population expenditure without the technical assistance flat rate. So we implement a correction on the correction amount, and let me call this correction amount the correction amount 2. So the amount 1 is without considering the technical assistance. The amount 2 is after considering the enlargement, the amplification for the technical assistance. Note, if all the programs that have been grouped have the same flat rate, the same rate for the flat rate, of course. The member state should include in the SFC the amounts of corrections without the flat rate, because the system will adjust automatically these for this flat rate. The more complex situation that we are not going to show here in detail in the calculation, because this is very much dependent on the specific case. It's the case where not all the group programs have the same flat rate, or as I said, some of them have a flat rate and some don't have. In this case, you have to ensure that the final financial corrections will comply with the correction amount 2, which is the correction amount where we amplify this amount by the flat rate correction. Okay, this is the only thing to do. A simple numerical example, although without showing the detail of some of the calculations. You group two programs, one with flat rate 6% and another one with a flat rate of 4%. First program has 200 million euros, second program 100 million euros. Well, for the first program plus 6% is 212 million euros, and for the second program, including the flat rate, including the technical assistant, is 104 million euros. The adjusted audit population used for the selection of the sample is the one without the flat rate, so it's 300 million euros. In this, you select a sample from this population of this 300 million. Then you, from this, project a certain error rate, imagine 3%. Okay, then the estimated error in expenditure declared to the Commission is 3% of the total declared expenditure, including flat rate, and the total declared expenditure, including flat rate, is 212 plus 104. So 3% of 212 plus 104 is not 9, but it's 9.48 million euros. So for the error rate, it's clear. For the residual error rate, again, it depends on the different mix that we have, and there are some complexities here, because it may happen that the corrections have been mostly made in a program with a certain flat rate or another program with a different flat rate. But what is important to understand is that we have to implement the corrections in such a way that the residual error rate, including the whole expenditure, will be below the 2%. Okay, and that's it. In the glance, it's very similar to what we have seen before, but some guidelines for technical assistance in the context of the post-2020. Can we provide this template? I'm not sure. I think so. Barbara, this technical assist, this residual error rate calculation template is available.
Excuse me, I have a colleague in the open space and I didn't hear well the question. Could you repeat?
The residual, this template of the residual error rate calculation is available for the audit authorities.
Yes, yes, I will put it now in here, but it is a part of our guidelines on annual control reports.
Thank you. So, any additional questions? Well, ladies and gentlemen, last topic for today is related with financial instrument advances. And we have three areas to analyze this. One is something that you probably already know very well, which is about implementation thresholds. Another thing that is very important for you and new, we have never presented before, is the methodology for closure. And the third line is about the post-2020 changes. I was thinking that if we would not have the time to cover everything in detail, I will give priority to the closure and to the post 2020. But because we have almost 1 hour until the end of our training, I believe that I can cover everything. And let me start with this sequence. Let me start with the implementation thresholds. I will be a little bit maybe faster in this. This is a long topic. Then I will be more detailed in terms of closure and the post 2020. Now, financial instruments advances. So we are talking about the selection of a sample inside the financial instrument. And in what regards this part of my presentation in relation with implementation thresholds, we are talking about selection of incurred expenditure in this form of investments and management costs and fees. What I'm saying firstly in this first stage is related with the financial instrument advance tranches in the programming period 2014-20. The extrapolation based on this sample is used for what? To establish if the conditions for the payment of the second and following tranches are fulfilled, as you know. So, what is the population? The population for the verification of these thresholds, implementation thresholds, consists in amounts that have been spent as eligible expenditure, and this includes payments to final recipients, maybe payments to the benefit of financial recipients in some cases of Article 37, resources committed for guarantee contracts, and the reimbursement of management costs incurred or payment of management fees of the financial instrument. The recommended approach that we have in this context, as you probably very well know, is that you establish a population of the above incurred amounts, basically to verify if the thresholds require, the implementation thresholds for the financial instruments are or not fulfilled. What are the sampling units? The investments in the form of loans, guarantees or equity, a management and a cost fee in the case of reimbursement of management costs incurred or a payment of management fees of the financial instrument. Can we stratify the population? Yes, you may decide either to draw the sample directly from the whole population of financial instruments, or you may stratify the population into subpopulations. Possible stratification categories: possibly stratify between loans, guarantees, equity investment, and these management and cost fees. This is a possibility if you consider this is relevant, they have different risks. It can be a good practice to stratify, but not mandatory. Also, in terms of stratification, if you have a financial instrument that is implemented by several intermediaries, you may also stratify the population by investment type, as we have seen, fully disregarding these intermediaries, or you can stratify the population by financial intermediary, or you can even do a mix of both, and you can stratify per investment within the financial beneficiary. That's up to you. If you use stratification, as you very well know, the rules for stratification are always the same, and the sample size allocation follows the usual rules. So if it is based on MUS, it is allocated proportionally to the stratum expenditure, but other forms of allocation are allowed if you consider that other forms of allocation are relevant, and in particular if there are some subgroups of the population that have particular risks. Sampling method, as usual, can be equal probability selection, as in sampling, and probability proportional to size, as in MUS. And if you use simple random sampling, again, don't forget that you can either use or not a stratification by expenditure, including or not this high value stratum is optional. On the contrary, in the case of MUS, the high value stratum is not introduced by design, is a feature of the sampling method itself. In any case, if you consider that part of the population has a particular risk, whatever that part is, does not mean that it's a part of the population of high value items, can be composed by any other categorization. You can have a more comprehensive sample of this part of the population, or even an exhaustive observation of this part of the population. But from time to time, we are going to introduce some examples, because this is a very, let's say, descriptive part of this seminar with lots of information, and it's much easier to follow by example. So if during an audit of financial instrument operation, including management costs, equity investments and loans, this audit authority decided to check all the management costs. They consider that they have a specific risk, and all the equity investments, but they apply a statistical sample for the loans. So it's perfectly possible based on the risk assessment that you perform. During this verification of the implementation thresholds, may you use the results from previous audits? Of course. The verification of the second and following tranches requires, as you know, the evaluation of compliance with some implementation thresholds, and these thresholds are 60% and 85% respectively, related to the amounts included in the preceding applications. If the financial instrument operation was already subject to previous audit, verifying the condition of 60 or 85% of expenditure for previous tranches, then 2 or even 3 period sampling designs can be used. So this means that you may decide in a certain moment to audit only the additional incurred expenditure and profit from the audit that you have already done, but this strategy is absolutely optional, and you may prefer to select a completely new sample that covers the incurred expenditure from the start of the implementation of the financial instrument. Okay, it's absolutely optional. It's whatever you prefer. What are some situations where you can use the results of previous audits? Some examples. Well, one, in the previous audit work, during the audit of the second or third tranche, the audit authority covered through a random sampling procedure a population of incurred expenditure. These results can then be used for the audit of the following tranches, where they need to verify the condition of 85% of eligible expenditure. This is a classical situation. You can use past data. Other situation is during closure. During closure audit, the audit authority may like to use the results of the samples they have already audited during the audit of the tranches, and you are welcome to do so, and this will be a part of your final audit opinion on closure. Other options, during the audit of the second and other tranches, you conclude that implementation threshold of 60 or 85 was not fulfilled. In that case, the amount of the tranche was deducted from the accounts and declared again in a following accounting year after additional expenditure was incurred. In that case, the AA could use the results of this previous audit for the tranche and again carried out additional sampling procedure only for the new additional expenditure incurred. So all of these are examples where the multi-period approach, although optional, could be used. An example here, long one, my God, but again, I think in this this very descriptive topic, the examples are extremely good. This is a long one, but I think it's very clear. During the audit of the first tranche, let me call your attention to the bold parts of the text, okay? During the audit of the first tranche of, let's say, 10 million, for example, for a financial instrument, with the total amount committed of 40 million, okay? And at this first audit, of course, the audit authority has only covered the setup of the instrument, and the implementation was excluded from the audit scope. Now, imagine that in the audit of the second tranche of 10 million, now the AA covered the implementation period as from the start of the financial instrument up to the date of the second audit. And imagine this corresponds to amount of 9 million euros of 9 million euros that has been disbursed to the final recipients. Now, just for the sake of this example, where you want to create different situations, imagine that the third tranche was not audited, was not selected as a part of your random sample for the audit of operations. And finally, at the fourth tranche, you covered the implementation period from the date used for audit the second tranche up to the date of the audit of the first tranche. A part of the incurred expenditure until that second tranche was already audited. Imagine that this additional population is a population of 19 million euros, okay? Imagine that you have detected in this audit irregularities in the amount of 1.2 million euros, leading to an extrapolated error. What matters is extrapolated error of 2 million euros out of these 19 that was incurred expenditure until this moment of the audit. And you have calculated, as usual, precision. The precision is 0.3 million euros. Now, how do we evaluate the compliance with the required threshold of the 85% in the 3 preceding tranches? Well, to do this, you have this extrapolated error of 2 million euros. Let's imagine that no errors were found when you have audited the tranche of the 9 million euros. So basically, this means that you have until now a population composed by 2 parts. A first part of 9 million euros for which no errors were found, and a part of 19 million euros for which 2 million euros of projected, you have 2 million euros of projected error. In total, you have an audited amount of an audited incurred amount of 28 million euros, 9 plus 19. The incurred amount minus your projected error of 2 million is 26 million. Now, what you need to do is to compare your 26 million after deducting the errors with implementation threshold of 85%. 85% of 30 million is 25.5 million. It means that your clean amount is still above this 85% implementation threshold. This is also confirmed by the precision, and this means that you can conclude that the conditions for payment of the fourth tranches are complied, and it's done the work until now. Later on, at this moment, at the audit of the fourth tranche, in this example, the audit authority has decided to audit the additional incurred expenditure in relation to the previous audit, but they could have decided to select a new independent sample from the whole implementation from the beginning of this financial instrument, and they could have selected an independent sample covering the whole incurred expenditure until that moment, and the conclusion would be based on that sample. So it's a completely optional for you. In this example, we have to just try to exemplify how you can combine the audit of new incurred expenditure with conclusions of the previous audits that have been based on previous incurred expenditure. In terms of sampling parameters, you use, as you know, the standard rules for statistical sampling, but there are two very important changes. I don't know if I should say changes because the principle is the same, but in practice this is different. One change is, what do we mean here by tolerable error or materiality? What is our materiality in this context? Because it's a completely different context, it's the context of incurred expenditure. And how do you select the confidence level? In what regards the tolerable error, for the implementation of the 60 and 85 thresholds, the tolerable error is to be set as the difference between the amount actually spent and the minimum implementation threshold. And materiality level is basically the tolerable error expressed as percentage of the population value. A note: in the case that the eligible expenditure already spent is very close to this required threshold, in fact, by using statistical sampling formulas may result in very high sample sizes, and you understand why. Because if the expenditure spent is already very close to the threshold, this means that you have to plan for an extremely small precision, and an extremely small precision automatically brings you to very large sample sizes. So one of the things that you can do is the following: the use of the population at the date of the audit and not the population at the date of the payment declaration of the tranche commission may help to decrease the sample size, because by the date of the audit you may have already more incurred expenditure. An example: to verify the compliance with the 60% implementation threshold during the second tranche, we had at the stage of declaring the second tranche of 10 million, 6.3 million were already spent, so 63% of the first tranche, so slightly above the required threshold, just 0.3 million above the threshold. In order to facilitate, to have a more manageable sample size, imagine, just for the sake of the example, that at the stage of the audit, the implementation was already 6.7 million, not 6.3, but already 6.7. The audit authority, for the sampling procedure, can either use, it's up to you, either the population of 6.3 million or the population of the 6.7 million. But if you use the population of the 6.7 million, this means that your tolerable error will be larger and potentially you can use more manageable sample sizes. Other things that are similar but slightly different from the normal rules for the standard audit of operations. Anticipated error. Well, here the anticipated error is calculated in very much standard way, which is the error that you expect based on the value of the expenditure spent. And basically for the anticipated error, as in many other places, you have to use either historical data from audits of financial instruments in the past or a pilot sample as usual. Something that is different is the confidence level. In the normal, let's say, audit of operations, depending on the categorization of the control systems, you know that between category 1 and category 4, you use something between 60% and 90% of confidence levels. Here we are using something different. It depends on the materiality level. So the larger the materiality level, the smaller the confidence level can be. So for category 1 system, this confidence level can be between 60% and 90%. But it's good that even for category 2 or category 3 systems, you can also start with the confidence levels of 60%. Only for category 4 system, you have to start with a confidence level of 80%. So there's nothing to know. It's just to go to this table to select the correct confidence level and convert this confidence level into a certain Z value from the normal distribution using the Excel template or any other, or even an Excel formula or whatever you like to use. Another relevant parameter is the standard deviation. The standard deviation, again, for this, you can use, again, as for the anticipated error, either historical data or a pilot sample. If you select a pilot sample, as usual, we recommend that this pilot sample includes 30 items because this is the minimum for statistical sample, and this may allow you to treat this pilot sample as the final sample if results are conclusive. If you calculate sample sizes, nothing to it. You calculate sample sizes with usual formulas. This is the global sample size calculation for MUS. If you are deciding to use a multi-period approach, you use the formulas of MUS for multi-period approach. If you are using simple random sampling, you use the normal formula of simple random sampling. And again, for the multi-period approach, understanding that here the tolerable error have a specific nature, that the Z value is adapted to these confidence levels that we are talking about, but the formulas themselves and the approach themselves are exactly the same for each one of these methodologies. Example. Main sample of the audit authority included the second tranche of a financial instrument. We selected a statistical sample using MUS standard approach from this population of 3 million euros in order to verify compliance with the 60% implementation threshold. I just input the values into this formula and I got a sample size of 35. Now, imagine that I'm now in the third tranche, the audit of the third tranche. In the audit of the third tranche, I have additional incurred expenditure, and this depends on your choice. If your choice is to audit at this third tranche only the additional incurred expenditure from the previous audit, this means that you are going to treat this as a multi-period sampling, and it's extremely simple. You just use the normal formulas and you input to this formula the correct parameters and you get a new sample size. For instance, in my example, the new sample size for this new audit was 17 new units that will later be combined with the original units that have been audited in the first moment. After you have verified the additional 17 units, what do you have? You have some data regarding the first period where you have audited 35 units to verify the compliance with the 60% threshold, and you have some data for the second period regarding the additional 17 units, and now you are going to use the extrapolated results, combining both periods in order to conclude about the 85% threshold implementation. Important notice that information that is, of course, of extreme importance. In some cases, carrying out additional sampling procedure may not be practical, because, in particular, if the threshold of the 6 or 85 was not reached. It may happen that the verification of a very limited number of items from the population not yet sampled can do the trick. And for example, if you just select 2 biggest investments, this will be sufficient to establish the compliance with the threshold. What I was meaning by very important was not that, but what is in this slide. What is very important is to state that during the first audit of a financial instrument, you are able to apply a simplified methodology for the implementation of this threshold, either with verification of 10% of the sampling units in the population of the financial instrument, and also with the possibility to cap the sample size to 30. So the simplified methodology means at least 10% of the units to a maximum of 30 units. For the following tranches, you may also have a simplified approach where, based on professional judgment, you can, for the additional period, you can select a sample of at least 5 to 10% of the sample units. And again, with the possibility to cap the sample size of the additional sample covering the additional period to 10 sampling units. Okay, so start with the minimum of 30, and then you can cap the following audits to 10 units in each audit. In any case, it's absolutely important that if you have stratum periods, at least 3 units are selected for each stratum as in compliance with the general rule that we always have. So here's just an example. In the audit of the second tranche, we used selected 30 items from the implementation from the population to verify the 60% implementation threshold, and then for the audit of the third tranche, we decided to use our capped sample size of 10 additional items regarding expenditure not subject to previous audit. And at closure, we can again select additionally 10 additional items from the remaining population that was not covered in the previous audit. So it's always like this: start with 30, and each time you can cap your additional work to 10. The projection and the precision are calculated as usual. The upper level limit is calculated as usual. And I would say nothing special to say here, just a final example of a situation where I have calculated both the projected error and the upper error limit, and we have concluded about eligibility of the expenditure. So let's say nothing new in relation to what I've said before. So I would stop here. This fast, but I know very detailed overview about the financial instruments in what regards the verification of the implementation thresholds. And from now on, probably I'm going to talk about the most important topics that are new, which is about closure and about the post-2020. But before I do that, although we are still within the same chapter, I think it's moment to make a stop and to ask you if you have any comments or questions regarding this first part about the implementation thresholds. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, closure. So we have all we have seen so far, the implementation thresholds, and then in a certain moment, there is closure. Some ideas about closure. Total projected every rate used for the purpose of the annual audit opinion is calculated based on the expenditure declared to the Commission, including grants and financial instrument advances. Financial instruments incurred expenditure is not included in the sampling population for the calculation of the projected error rate, as you know. Nevertheless, although this is true, this expenditure has also been audited during the verification of the implementation tranches, exactly as we have seen, either for the verification of the 60% at the second tranche or the 85% in the following tranches. This means that a part of the incurred expenditure of the financial instrument at closure does not have a chance to be checked within the audit of operations. And to cover this gap, some additional work for the financial instrument is expected at closure. What is this type of work that is expected? It is a type of work basically complementing the audit work that you have already carried out during the programming period. First of all, let me remind you that the assurance that you get at closure for the financial instrument is obtained through different ways, through systems audits, through the audit of operations during the implementation of the thresholds for the tranches as we have just seen until now, and finally, a new thing, at closure, through the audits at closure, covering the incurred expenditure not covered in the audits of the tranches. There will be some new expenditure that has not been audited during the audit of the tranches. So how to perform the audit at closure? First of all, how do we select the financial instruments within closure? Some news, as you may know. Not all the financial instruments need to be selected for closure audits. It's a matter of professional judgment, the number of financial instruments that you need to consider in the audit in the context of closure. These professional judgment should take into consideration different things. Some of the obvious things are the number and the complexity of the financial instruments, how much work has already been done before within the audits of operations or the systems audits, how much is your assessment, your opinion about the risk of irregularities based on the previous audit work that you have performed, and as usual, any other information that you have available in order to form your opinion. And of course, the more the risk, the more comprehensive your work should be, the less the risk, less comprehensive it needs to be. You have basically three options for closure. Either you select a random sample of financial instruments out of the total list of financial instruments for the entire programming period, and for this selection you use either simple random sampling or MUS, so equal probability selection or probability proportional to expenditure, or you select some financial instruments on professional judgment and some based still on random selection. It may happen that you say, I want to audit these and these financial instruments, and for the others, I will select a random sample. And the third option is that you select all the financial instruments, which is also fine, of course. So a little bit of detail for each one of these three options. Imagine that you decide to select a purely random sample of financial instruments for the whole list. An example, which is of course pretty obvious, but just to be clear, imagine that you have 10 financial instruments for the program within the programming period, and you have decided to select 3 randomly based on your professional judgment and using MUS selection. Okay, so you select these 3 based on MUS, and then you have 3 in your sample, and for each one of the selected of the financial instruments in your sample, you will apply a separate sample. For each financial instrument, you can use a simplified methodology that is proposed in the methodological paper, and again, select randomly just 10 investments or other expense items from the additional population of the incurred expenditure, as I have explained before, that for any additional audit, you can cap your sample size to 10. Second example, very similar. You decide that you want to select some FIs based on professional judgment and some FIs based on random selection. Imagine the same population of 10 financial instruments. An audit authority may decide the following. There are 2 financial instruments that you really want to audit based on professional judgment because reasons may be different. For instance, one of them, it's because it has a very high incurred expenditure, so it's very prominent in terms of expenditure. And another one is because it has shown problems or irregularities in the past, and you consider that it has a specific risk. And then you're going to select another one randomly from the remaining list of financial instruments. And again, you have selected 3 financial instruments, and for each one of them, again, you apply a separate sample. In this example, just for the sake of this exemplification, if you don't want to audit each financial instrument as an additional period, but you want to audit it as from the beginning of the instrument, covering the whole incurred expenditure, in that case, you can do it, have a global new sample, but you can cap this sample to 30 items. If you treat this as an additional period, you can cap to 10. If you treat this as a whole new sample, you can cap to 30 items. Third option, you decide to select all the financial instruments. No problem. Imagine this is most typical in a situation where you don't have many financial instruments. Imagine that you have 3 financial instruments. You decide to audit all of them. But then, after doing this, there are different options that you can follow. For instance, you can decide to select a separate sample for one of the financial instruments, but then group the other 2. Let me skip this. And then, and of course, if you do this, you can treat this as 2 separate strata. Another example within the selection of all the financial instruments. You have 3 financial instruments and you decide to check them all. And instead of doing any kind of grouping or stratification, you are going to use a simplified method where you take just 30 items from the whole population comprising the 3 instruments. It's also an option to do this in regard to this, let's say, group population of the 3 instruments. For all of these 3 options, either you select instruments randomly, or you select your instruments partially based on professional judgment, or even if you decide to select all your financial instruments, there are always different options in terms of grouping. You can audit each financial instrument separately, and if you audit it separately, it means that for each financial instrument, either you have to take a sample of 30 or a sample of 10, depending if you are covering the whole incurred expenditure or just the additional incurred expenditure. You can decide, option B, you can decide to group some of the financial instruments based on professional judgment, and the sample will be selected from the group of the financial instruments. If you have financial instruments that are not grouped with other ones, these ones will be audited individually. Example, you have 7 financial instruments that you select randomly out of 30, and you decide that you want to audit 5 of them separately, and that other 2 are grouped together for some reasons. This is an option for you. And in fact, you have six, let's say 6 groups to audit. 5 are real individual instruments, and 1 is a group of 2 instruments. And option C is to group all the financial instruments. So basically, all the financial instruments that are selected of the population or selected to your sample are grouped together in one single group. And in that case, you just take your sample from this group of financial instruments. One thing is for sure, and what I'm going to say to you is not a novelty, is not specific to financial instruments. It's common to all sampling methods, which is the following. When you group, you already know that the conclusions that you will obtain will be applicable to all the financial instruments within the group and not to each financial instrument individually. What is the advantage of grouping? As for the normal expenditure, the big advantage of grouping is the possibility to reduce the sample size, of course. Instead of, if you group 3, instead of having to take 3 samples, you can just take 1 sample. What is the disadvantage of grouping, like for the main expenditure? The disadvantage of grouping is that the results are to some extent less robust at the level of the individual FEs, because very typically the results will not be representative by financial instrument. You can only produce a figure in terms of error for the group of the financial instruments, but not for each financial instrument individual. And of course, this may create some difficulties if you need to implement some corrections or remedial actions. Now, in the selection or in the sampling within the financial instrument. Now, zooming in the financial instrument, when you select a sample within the financial instrument, you should consider the following. A statistical sample per financial instrument can be carried out using as population, as I said before, all the incurred expenditure of that financial instrument or group, or only the additional expenditure not covered during previous audits. Okay, this is always also an option for you, and you can do as you please. Whatever is your decision, you can calculate your sample size with the statistical formulas for sample size calculation, as I have shown you for the sake of the implementation thresholds. But again, as I said before, you have this simplified, let's call it off-the-shelf sampling methodology, where you can cap your sample size to 30 items if you are covering the whole incurred expenditure, or 10 items if you are just covering a part of this expenditure and combining it with a previous sample that has already covered part of the expenditure. Last information about closure, an important one. If you have overbooking, the population of incurred expenditure to be audited for closure should include the amounts of overbooking. And if you need to calculate sample size based on a certain materiality threshold, specifically for closure, we advise that the materiality threshold for closure is 2% of the incurred expenditure if your incurred expenditure is below the total amount of advances, or if you have overbooking, then your materiality threshold for the calculation of the sample size will be the overbooking plus 2% of the advances. Again, this is relevant if you are not using the simplified methodology, where you automatically decide that you are going to audit 30 or 10 additional items. But in some cases, it may be beneficial for you to use a statistical formula, and it may happen that for a new period, you don't even need to cover the 10 additional items. You can just cover 5 or 6 additional items if you decide to use a statistical formula. And this is about closure, and I just have a few more slides about the post-2020. But before I do so, I know I'm doing another stop, and I know this is a lot of stuff, new stuff about closure, but it's important for me to make a stop here and ask you if you have any questions about this new information regarding the closure for the financial instruments. Very last part of what we need to tell you about financial instruments, the post-2020. The population for the post-2020 is in fact very much in line with the principles that we have seen so far. There are maybe some specificities to take into consideration. The FNLC will be part of the sampling population. In the period of 1420, it was excluded from sampling population due to some legal provisions. Like in 1420, the sampling population for financial instruments will include declared expenditure. In the new programming period, very importantly, there will be no advances dependent on the implementation thresholds. Because we don't have this, all the methodology that we have seen in a big part of my last presentation related with the verification of the implementation thresholds will now be irrelevant. We don't need to implement that methodology. This is a big change, of course. The sampling population to be used for the selection of the sample will include the expenditure incurred for the financial instrument and advance declared to the Commission. The advance includes the amounts included in the first payment application paid to the financial instruments up to 30% of the total amount, and the amount of incurred, the amount included in subsequent payment applications submitted during the period covering the eligible expenditure. So we have this advance and we have the incurred expenditure. The amounts of eligible expenditure clearing the advance and that are disclosed separately in payment applications will not be part of the sampling population used for the selection of the main sample. This is also an important thing. Now, what else can we tell you for the post-2020? That the audits of the advances declared to the Commission within the audit of operations, well, that the audits of the financial instrument advances do not require verification of incurred expenditure at all. In what regards the audits of the incurred expenditure, because we have these two things, the advances and the incurred expenditure. In what regards the audits of the incurred expenditure, the amounts of incurred expenditure included in the audit population will be sampled in the same way as any other amounts outside the financial instruments. And if you find any errors in the incurred expenditure, they will contribute to the calculation of the total error rate, okay? They will be extrapolated to the population, and if you do have a stratification, of course, that in that case, the errors in this incurred expenditure will be projected to this specific strating instead of being projected to the whole population. Now, very last slide, and this ends the only details that are particular to the post-2020. This is an example of what I have just said. Imagine that in the first accounting year, the audit authority selects for the sample 30 operations, and two sampling units are related to financial instruments. And among these two, I have an advance of 2 million euros and an amount of incurred expenditure of 100,000 euros. During the audit of the advance of 2 million, the audit authority is not checking any incurred expenditure and is just concluding that the conditions for payment of the advance are fulfilled and that the advance is eligible. This is for the advance. For the audit of the other sampling unit, which is the incurred amount of 100,000 euros, you audit the possible existence of errors and imagine that you have detected an irregular loan of 5,000 euros out of 100,000, including this sampling unit. So for that sampling unit, you have an error of 5,000, which is 5% of the expenditure. And this 5% error rate for this sampling unit will be projected to the population either with or without stratification as we calculate the contribution of any other sampling unit to the total error rate of the population. Okay, and that's it. Right on time. Everything about financial instruments, which is, to be honest, even for myself, the longest and the part of this presentation that has more specific details and maybe in some cases a little bit confusing the details. So guys, finally, last opportunity to have some questions regarding post-2020 for financial instruments, or although I believe this last part was short and clear, or any other questions related with, we have 5 minutes, any other questions related to anything I have said during the day, or even anything else that has not been covered here. Okay. Any questions, final questions? I don't think any questions. Miss Barbara Korczak, any final remarks or clarification from your side?
I just sent, put in chat a small information that I know that some people could open files without the problem, but in case there are persons which could still not get all the documents, please contact us to our functional mailbox. Is CET audit coordination, the same functional mailbox from where you get invitation, and we will send by emails.
Thank you very much.
Maybe also one small issue, because there are many questions we were receiving before the seminar, the questions during the seminar, maybe not everyone could participate. So based on what was discussed, we'll try with Professor Coelho to prepare a document with the questions and answers, in particular concerning the new programming period, maybe also closure for financial instruments. But it will take us a few weeks before we will finalize, agree with the professor internally. Thus, probably in February, at the latest in March, we'll send you like a bigger document with many clarifications.
You have a question for how long the recording is available? I'm not sure. I'm going to check. Let me just try to confirm. So regarding the records in YouTube, as you know, during these trainings, there are always a lot of breaks. So the IT specialists are going to edit the videos, so you can see the videos without all these breaks, which means that we expect to have the clean recordings available by the end of this week, by Friday, okay? And I think you said for how long they will be available. Well, they will be available for as long as we wish. So I will check with the colleagues in the commission for how long we will keep these videos available, but for surely a sufficient amount of time. Please also take into consideration very important email address that Ms. Barbara Korczak has placed in the chat tool, which is the functional mailbox from the DAC Audit Coordination Unit, from where you can query some of the, to ask for some of the documents, templates, files, whatever that you have noticed during these presentations that you could have, but maybe presently some of you don't have. So, ladies and gentlemen, if no other questions, thank you very much for your attention. I absolutely know this is very tiring, a whole day discussing this, and we all know that by the end of the day, we are all a little bit more tired, but I believe it was very helpful. And even for us, as Ms. Barbara Korczak said, it was helpful because sometimes we cannot fully anticipate what are your doubts and questions regarding all these issues. And through the questions that you have placed during the day, we have a more clear picture of what are these key points, and we can also prepare a good Q&A document for you and other colleagues that were not here to follow. Thank you very much. Hope to see you soon.